Also added at the bottom there, the contract support, the FTE equivalents at the bottom there. In industry averages in local government like ours, we should be running about 20 to 25% of our manning should be contract support. That's kind of the average, and that's about what we're running. We see the little bump there in 2019, and again, that was the cyber recovery, and so we had a lot of contract support during that time. So the next slide talks about some of the accomplishments in the last year. Obviously, the big one has been the pandemic support. As we moved into working from home, obviously IT came into play there, where we're getting more and more equipment, and we're getting people working from home, and we had to reconfigure it. So we had a lot of changes there. So it was probably our biggest lift in the past year. We also made some progress on our big project there, and that's a Govern upgrade. Govern, of course, is our CAMA system and our taxation system. And actually getting progress on that project has been difficult during the pandemic, but we have made some major progress on that one. The other accomplishments that are probably noteworthy, as you see there, the imagery and the LiDAR. This is kind of some of the data that we collect around there. This data is used for a lot of other departments to make them more efficient. So we have found properties that weren't on the tax rolls in the past. We were able to gauge the size of properties because of some of this imagery. So a lot of that stuff has quite a return on investment. And the last slide talks a little bit about our major goals. And of course, my goal is to support the borough goals. And so the strategic goals that we talked about earlier, we talked about some e-commerce upgrades, we talked about public outreach. I'm here to provide tools to help make that happen. On the right side of that slide, there's a lot of little goals that we've got there, but the main thing is at the top there. We're looking to automate additional processes to become more efficient. So as our population grows and the demand for our services grows, if we can make our people inside the borough more efficient through automation, then we'll be able to do that with the same number of people, or not have to hire as many additional people. So that's what I've got for the briefing today. If there are any questions.
Oh. Questions for IT? Boy, looks like you're good to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Wyatt, appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got it. Okay.
Pardon me? I was glad to hear Mr. Hayes explain the mask rule. So from now on, I'm briefing without a mask. Terry Dolan, Director of Public Works. I heard Mr. Phillips say this was his 9th budget briefing to the Assembly. This is my 9th budget that I'm executing here at the borough. So Public Works Department looks a little bit different this year than what I briefed you last year. So you see 2 additional divisions that we added in December. So we've combined those manpower numbers in there. Just a disclaimer on the manpower chart. These are area-wide positions only. And that doesn't change anything that you see in a lot of different departments here in the borough. But for Public Works, it does change because this won't show you road service and it won't show you enterprise fund manpower. What it does show you is the reduction trend in manpower that's charged to the area-wide, which comes out of the area-wide mill rate. So that's the value of this. You can see the downward trend there of our burden on the area-wide mill rate. So budget to actuals, same slide as everybody else. You see the downward trend again in the spending. Part of that is manpower. Part of that is efficiencies that we've developed. And in terms of execution, I think we're executing it efficiently and prudently in terms of our spending. So, we're not attempting to spend every dollar that we receive every year. Where we can develop efficiencies, we're saving the money and returning it back to the funds that it came from. I wanted to parse out road service because the numbers easily get buried if you aggregate them together. On this slide on the left side, you see a lot of good data about why we have road service areas and how they work financially. And you can read that at your leisure. The other thing I wanted to point out, I showed you during the strategic planning meeting that we had, is that we're seeing an overall downward trend in the cost of our road maintenance contracts. We spend about $8 million a year in road maintenance contracts to get our roads plowed and do most of the routine maintenance, the brushing and that kind of stuff every year.
Through the mayor to Mr. Dolan, what do you think it is that's bringing that down? Is it because we got more pavement now, or what's bringing those maintenance costs down, sir?
Through the mayor to Mr. Young, certainly adding paved roads, and I'm going to show you some numbers on here, reduces the cost of maintenance. You get caught back up with the cost at around the 30-year mark when the life of that road really kind of expires and you have to replace the asphalt. You have a big payment to make every 30 years or so. But in the interim, the routine maintenance is significantly cheaper. Think about not having to run a grader up and down a road, maybe up to 10 times a year, depending on the weather. So yeah, there's a lot of savings after the pavement is done. Plus there's the resident enjoyment factor as well that you get out of that. That's part of it. I think the other part is that really at the far left of this chart is where we saw a huge hit on the price of oil, and that means the price of fuel for operating heavy equipment. And so these maintenance folks are able to do this at a lower price than they used to be able to, just because of how cheap the fuel is.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the lifespan of asphalt, say it's 30 years. I could be wrong, but I would still imagine the money we save in the 30 years leading up to that is still substantially more than the cost of replacement, is it not? Or do you think it's truly a break even in the long run and all we're getting out of asphalt is enjoyment?
I think ultimately it is cheaper to use asphalt, especially right now, because of the oil prices being low.
Yep.
When you see oil up above $100 a barrel, the asphalt prices go up with it. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little tougher to make the comparison there. But I think overall, there's a long-term cost savings of having asphalt.
Thank you.
To choose?
Yeah, through the mayor to Mr. Dolan. I wonder if we could get some prices on RSAs that are mostly gravel, what they go for a mile, and then also RSAs that are mostly paved, and see what the price difference is.
I can provide that. We have that data.
Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not just the pavement versus gravel that drives the price. We see frequently that the smallest RSAs cost the most to maintain, mostly because there's less road miles to spread the overhead and administrative costs over. And so the cost per mile goes up as you get into these smaller RSAs. The other trend across the borough in terms of price is that the further you get from the core area, the more costly it is to maintain. And to some degree, that may be related to the amount of asphalt versus gravel, but there may be other factors involved as well. For example, the cost of hauling fuel to the more remote parts of the borough. Obviously, we pay that cost to the contractor who has to bid on those kind of costs. So there are some interesting trends there, and we have the data and we'll share it.
Ms. Bovee?
I would think the snow removal cost would vary considerably too, depending on how far north you went. So that would be reflected, right, in the contract cost, price per mile, or is that totally calculated differently?
So I apologize. I didn't understand the first part of your question.
The areas that have more snow removal needs, does that get bid out as a higher price per mile, or is that a separate?
So these are flat rate contracts, but you make a good point. I mean, there's an area of the borough, in the southern part of the borough, it would be to the west of the Parks Highway. But as you move north, this band I'm referring to sort of moves across the Parks Highway and incorporates like Willow and Talkeetna. And that band I'm talking about is a real heavy precipitation band where weather can come directly up the inlet and directly on shore. And that's why you see so much more snow in places like Willow and up towards Talkeetna. And then as the terrain starts to rise, as you get near any one of our mountain ranges, we see additional snow there. I think right now in Willow, and maybe the mayor can verify this, we've got something like 6 feet of snow on the ground in Willow right now. And in some places between Willow and Talkeetna, there's 9 feet of snow on the ground. So there's an enormous amount of snow, way more than what you see here in the Palmer-Wasilla area. And of course, those contractors that have to deal with that bid, what they think it's going to cost them to handle that. I've heard some of our contractors in the far north of the borough say that they plan against 21 to 22 major snow events every winter for plowing. So I'm going to get into solid waste here a little bit. Again, we parse this out because it's not area-wide funded. So you can take a look at what their numbers look like there. I put a couple call outs on the graph just to show you why we under executed in 2019 and 2020. We're actually able to develop a lot of savings, and in the case of 2019 wage and benefit savings, we restructured our compacting contract that saved us over $500,000 there as well that we weren't anticipating. And then there were some vehicles and equipment that we just didn't purchase because we decided we could extend the life of the ones we had. So those are kind of savings and efficiencies that caused that gap between what was budgeted and what we actually executed in those years. And you can see a similar savings over there that we developed in 2020 as well. So whenever you talk about solid waste, you have to talk about their capital requirements. They're enormous. The cost of building a landfill cell is somewhere around $7 million. That's a line to sell. It costs another $5 million or so to close it later on. And it costs us, at least it used to cost us right around $35 million or so to fill it. I think we're closer to $30 million now over the life of a landfill cell to fill it and compact it properly. So there's large capital costs involved in operating those facilities. Most recently, the mandatory addition of a gas management system was a large capital expense. These things don't occur every year, and so the cost goes up and down very, very quickly from year to year. We plan for 5-6 year cell life, something like that, and then you have an open and a closure cost all of a sudden. So I've got a laundry list there. You can read them on the right side of the chart. But it's important to understand on the operating slide I just showed you, we're working very hard to reduce our operating costs. But those would get buried if I combine them with these capital costs that you see on this slide right here.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. The solid waste position that was there that disappears after 2019, what's that position?
After 2019, was it this slide you're talking about or the previous one?
The department divisions, when you have your FTEs, there's 0.47 of a FTE for solid waste in 2018 and 2019.
Okay. So what that was at the time in 2018 and 2019, the community cleanup person had a portion of their pay coming out of the area-wide account. And then in 2020, we transitioned that to be entirely inside the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund. So there's a lot of things going on in the borough that are paid for out of receipts at the gate at the landfill, in addition to operating the landfill. For example, all the recycling work that gets done around the borough is paid for from fees at those gates. Community cleanup is entirely paid for by fees at the gate. A lot of our vehicle towing and that kind of stuff is paid for out of those funds. So because this chart here is area wide, all you see is that portion that was coming out of area wide, and then that disappears in 2020. Does that answer your question?
It does. So basically, to kind of piece it all together, we need to go to the non-area wide and look at that as well.
Yeah, if you wanted to examine, but you wouldn't see, for example, in solid waste, you wouldn't see anything in non-area wide. That's going to show you Mr. Phillips's library folks and animal care and all those things that are non-area wide authorities. If you want to see all the people that are in solid waste, you have to take a specific look just at that enterprise fund and the manpower associated with it. I think Mr. Brown briefed you earlier that we're asking for one more laborer this year than we have in the past. And that's certainly up to the assembly if you want to do that. But you won't see it on an area-wide slide like this.
Okay. And then just kind of curious, like in the kind of unknowns, you know, there's always things that can come along and take a big chunk out of your budget, and that landfill gas collection was one of them. You know, are there things that kind of maybe not keep you up at night, but in terms of potential expenses, you know, that landfill gas collection, we're going to be working on that, but is that kind of we have to make sure it works kind of situation? And then the Smith ball fields is another one I think of. Are there things out there that would be good to just be aware of, that these might be expenses, fairly sizable ones that, you know, if the worst case happened, that, you know, are just good to be aware of as things that might happen in the future that would impact us?
I do have some good news on Smith ball fields to share that we just received this week from DEC, and you'll see it in the manager's activities report that Mr. Brown publishes. But we received a final decision from DEC this week that told us that natural attenuation was acceptable for dealing with Smith ball fields at this time with increased monitoring. So for assembly members that might not be aware of the situation there, Smith ball fields is built on top of an old dump that supported the city of Wasilla in the 1970s and other facilities along the KGB corridor. The U.S. Army used to have a Nike Hercules anti-aircraft unit down in the Point McKenzie area to protect Elmendorf Air Force Base. And that military facility dumped waste into that dump along with everyone else in between those places. And a number of years ago, we collected data on the groundwater that seeps out of that dump, and we started seeing diesel range organics and gasoline range organics. So organic chemicals that are consistent with gasoline and diesel fuel in the water in the area around that old dump. And we knew it was a possibility that DEC would make us excavate all that material out of there and haul it to a lined landfill cell. And we were estimating that could cost as much as $25 million. But DEC at this point has decided not to disturb that waste pile. The problem with disturbing it by excavating it is that sometimes you release more chemicals into the ground than are being released under the current circumstances. So that's good news. We don't think we'll have a giant bill to pay for Smith ball fields at this point. We will have some increased groundwater monitoring costs. If that goes well, I don't expect DEC to require anything additional of us. We'll probably be doing groundwater monitoring out there for the next 30 years, is my thought. There's also a handful of other old dumps around this borough where we monitor the groundwater. At any one of those sites, we could have similar problems in the future. So there's some of them, the one over in the Butte is not very far from a school. And so we monitor the water at the school as well, just to make sure that there's no chemicals coming out of that old dump site getting into the school's water. But there's a lot of potential for those kinds of problems. Everywhere around the borough where there used to be a dump, and there used to be one where every place where there was clusters of people living is a potential site that we could have these kind of problems in.
And just kind of a last question, did the Borough landfill itself has got a permit renewal or cell opening. Are you expecting any additional costs due to that? Additional testing that would be required by DEC, or do you have any sense of if there might be some additional costs from the DEC requirements that might come with that?
So I think it's very reasonable to expect increased costs. DEC puts unfunded mandates on us routinely, not only at the 5-year permit renewal, but anytime before that they think it's appropriate to add additional requirements to our permit. So I think that's a reasonable thing to worry about. But if we do find ourselves in a situation where I don't have enough operating money to cover the cost of adding some DEC requirement, what I'll do is I'll come back here to the assembly and request that you allow me to use funds out of our fund balance. And that's exactly what we did with the gas collection system. There was enough money in there that we were able to do that without going and trying to find a loan somewhere. In the future, I don't think there's going to be as much money in the fund balance because the assembly reduced the rates, and that will cut something like around $1 million out of our revenue every year. So I think it's more likely in the future I'll have to come back to the assembly and ask you to provide funds if we find ourselves in a bind like we did with this gas management system.
So through the mayor, are the old dumps a liability of the enterprise fund, or is that even a meaningful thing to differentiate? And I see the attorney shaking his head.
So I think it's entirely up to the assembly who pays the bill on those things.
To a large part, yes. I mean, the borough is responsible. Terry's worked very closely with the legal department on some of these issues. The borough is responsible, the source of funding for it. There is some flexibility, but I think currently it's being managed by Mr. Dolan's department and the enterprise fund.
I was going to ask something similar to that line, is when all the dumps were shut down in the borough, was there some kind of agreement with the federal government or anything when we started the central landfill?
I don't know the answer in general as to this specific location. There are documents showing that we are responsible. And so when, we looked very closely at that. Of course, that's part of the job of the legal department. Are we even responsible for what occurred back there? If it was other people putting things in and whatnot, we are.
Smith Ball Fields, inside the city of Wasilla?
Outside.
Outside? Must be just outside.
It's not very far outside. It's right next to the Iditarod headquarters there.
Right. I thought Iditarod headquarters was inside the city of Wasilla.
I don't believe that it is, but I could be mistaken.
I could do.
Don't tell the board director I said that.
What year? When I first got on assembly, the enterprise fund was losing $2 to $2.5 million a year. We're in the red. So we've been in the black how many years in a row now? Probably 7.
So you asked me this question, I think about 3 years ago, and what I told you at the time, and I believe that was true, is that on an operating basis, we were relatively revenue neutral. But when you incorporated the capital costs into the overall costs, we were not producing enough revenue to cover all of our needs. We probably actually were very close to revenue neutral in the last couple of years. But that's we moved further away from that with the rate setting event here that happened a month or so ago.
It's improved a lot then.
It has improved. It's something that I think, if you remember Butch Shapiro, who was the division manager there, something that he was very proud of. And we were very pleased with the progress that we made over time. And at the end of the day, I'm going to operate those facilities in the manner that the assembly wants me to. And if it means that we have to borrow more money, it means we have to borrow more money. I'll keep you apprised of that as those kinds of things occur, obviously. And I'm sure there will be future assemblies that will want to correct the financial situation there. And we'll make those corrections when the assembly is ready to do that.
If you borrow more money, that's being paid through the the revenue coming in through fees.
Yeah, so there's really two consequences to not charging what it costs, maybe three that I can think of, to not charging what it actually costs us to dispose of waste. One of the big ones is that it's anti-competitive. There are a lot of commercial operators out there who are in the same business that we are, collecting waste and disposing of it. And when we don't charge what it actually costs us to dispose of it, we create a situation where those commercial operators can't compete with us. A good example in your former district is on the Talkeetna Spur Road. There used to be a transfer station there. We ran that transfer station out of business because they couldn't compete with us. So that's one of the consequences. Another consequence is that we have to borrow money to pay for our operations, and that means we pay more. It costs us more to operate if we have to borrow money, around 2% more. And then the third consequence is that we pay those loans back over time, which means bags of trash that our children will be bringing into the landfill in the future will be paying the cost of the waste that we're bringing in there today. So none of those are great things, but there are certain circumstances where it makes sense for somebody to say, hey, our priority right now is taking care of folks in lean economic time. And so it may, it's reasonably prudent, I think, to take those things into account. And it's certainly up to the assembly to make a value judgment between those things and determine which way you want to go.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Toots?
I read an article this last week in a trade magazine, and it pointed out that Alaska is the most expensive place to get rid of garbage. And they quoted out like almost $140 a ton. And like the lower 48, the average is out about $70. So I hope that extra money helps us.
I think we killed that slide unless there's other questions there. Okay, I'm going to jump forward into the operations and maintenance division. These are the folks that maintain the facilities, our fleet vehicles, and our roadways. Lots of great accomplishments there. 2 big fish passage projects, a lot of paving there that we were talking about earlier. And we're getting very close to being finished on our new treatment plant up in Talkeetna. In terms of their goals for this year, we're really kind of ramping up the number of projects that we're trying to complete in 1 year. And in addition to that, we're designing a number of other projects against the idea that in times like these, the federal government frequently comes out looking for shovel-ready projects that can be quickly constructed so they can bring stimulus money to bear. So we'll have a number of projects that are ready to go that we'll fund in future years if they last that long. But if the federal government comes out looking for construction projects to do, we'll have some available for that. That's a great fish passage pipe picture there, by the way. That's over in Mr. McKee's district off of Fairview Loop. So back to solid waste in terms of accomplishments. I love this this picture when I first saw it, and so I made room for it here in this briefing. That's our landfill gas flare. And you've seen flares probably on like gas drilling rigs, oil drilling rigs, a big flame coming out a pipe in the side of the rig. That was a possibility for us here, but we know the landfill is difficult to live next to, and we didn't want to make it worse by installing a flare out there. So this particular flare, we paid a little extra for it, but the flame is all entirely enclosed within that vertical stack that you see there. So it doesn't make a whole bunch of light that disturbs our neighbors. So really great accomplishment getting that in very quickly. It's not 100% functional yet. We're still working on it, but it's like anything else. We're commissioning a brand new plant, and there's always problems when you do that. We've seen the same thing in Talkeetna with our new treatment plant up there. There's still lots of little irritants that have to be taken care of as we finish that. Really proud of the expansion in our beetle kill and brush collection expansions, mostly in District 7. And then cell 4, we built cell 4 last year. Obviously, you have to be ahead on your landfill cells because when cell 3 gets full, I need to have cell 4 ready before that. And we're very close to putting waste in there. We'll start putting waste in there this summer. There's a few things that we want to do. We'll have a contractor come in and put bedded gas collection pipes in the bottom of that landfill cell before we start putting waste in there. And then after we get a couple of lifts of municipal waste in there, it'll allow us to come in and dump leachate back into the cell. It helps you compact the waste, and it also helps activate the waste because that leachate carries a lot of bacteria. So it starts to break down the waste much faster than it normally would, and it produces more gas. And now that we have a gas management system, a gas collection system, we want to produce more gas because the more gas you produce, the more likely you reach a point where it's economically viable to exploit it for either heat or electricity or some other useful purpose. So goals for next year for solid waste. I think probably the biggest one that people will see is we're going to be rerouting traffic out there. We got a plan being developed right now to help reduce the lines. I know we don't have them here, but if you've ever been into a Chick-fil-A in the lower 48 at lunchtime, you know there are ways to accelerate these lines, and you can see them doing it there. And we're examining a number of those approaches, and you'll see us start to implement some of those this summer. Jumping over to project management, a lot of accomplishments there. I think somebody talked about some of the pool stuff earlier. Obviously, we tore down Houston Middle finally this last year, and we executed a whole bunch of CARES Act money very quickly in this building and other facilities around the borough. So those are probably the big accomplishments this last year. And then going forward in this division, it's all about vertical projects. And of course, number one on the list is Houston Middle. It won't be finished this year, but we'll probably have 80% of the work done this year with planning to open in August of 22. Willow Log Cabin should get done this year as well.
You think?
I do.
Okay.
Jumping over to pre-design and engineering. So these are our horizontal folks. They do road projects, parking lots, boat launches, that type of thing. Probably the biggest thing I want to point out here is that the division went out and engaged the state last year to look at whether or not the state could assist us in executing our 2018 road bond projects that were essentially unfunded, and came away with $30.7 million in state assistance on that. So that was a huge win, and those folks are really rightfully proud of that over there. They also executed a whole bunch of CARES money for us very rapidly. So good achievements there. In terms of goals looking ahead, there's Shirleytown, and yes, I think it's going to be done this year. It's coming along very quickly, so that's really great news. And probably the other thing I would point out is that division is going to be executing the earthquake damage repairs to the roads and the rail facilities out in the Point Mac area. That's all FEMA funded work. So they'll be working on that this summer. And that is all I have pending your questions.
Questions, Ms. Nowers?
Just on the, that traffic is a big issue for the residents who are by the dump, that backing up and getting in there. I just was curious if you could elaborate on what some of the possibilities might be. What are some of the ideas for dealing with that? 'Cause it's kind of one way in and one way out.
So there's a lot of things that we're working on, and we don't have a design to share with you yet, but we think in concept what we'll do is take residential traffic and bring it in through what we now use as the commercial gate that's over by animal care. And that'll allow us to route the traffic in a way where folks can come in, dump off their recyclables before they get weighed, then weigh in, and then they'll be able to hit the hazardous waste facility there, dump off any oils they have or anything like that, paints and whatnot, and dump off any scrap metal along that route. And then the last thing, municipal solid waste will go into the containers and then out. So it'll be a bigger loop. It'll allow traffic to flow much further into the system, and it'll allow folks to hit all of those key places along the way, including the recycling at the beginning, which we don't actually have a process like that now. We have added recycling containers in places out there, and they're producing an enormous amount of material. For example, we have a container now up in the C&D cell. So when somebody arrives with a whole bunch of recyclable materials in the C&D cell, we don't let them put it in there. Good example is in the summertime, the military moves a ton of people in and out of the borough, and they come away from those moves with giant piles of cardboard boxes and wrapping paper. And if you show up at the landfill on a day that the recycle center happens to be closed, they direct you to the C&D cell. As a matter of fact, the last time I moved out here to the valley, that's where my boxes went, was in the C&D cell. But now we've got containers up there to capture that stuff. And this idea of bringing folks in through the current commercial gate over there will allow folks to deposit recyclables on the same trip that they dispose of their municipal solid waste. So I think it's a great plan, and we're seeing. We think this year we're going to have double the amount of recyclables we had last year. So it's a program that's growing very quickly, and we're facilitating that by prudent routing of traffic and prudent placement of containers to pick that stuff up.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there's a cost to recycling, but it's super expensive to open cells and close cells. So you gotta weigh those options. The other question I just had is, and I just don't understand the implications of it super well, but the MPO, what if any budgetary impact is that going to have this year? And then, moving forward, is that going to have major changes in terms of how we budget for road? Like we'll have additional funding, but also additional costs. And I won't ask you to get into great detail because it might not be relevant for this year, but trying to get a better grasp on that.
So the MPO plan is not fully developed yet, but I can tell you a few things about it. It's likely to be a standalone entity that pays its own costs and brings additional money to the borough for road projects, money that's separate from the money that the assembly deals with. What we're looking at now in terms of the options for how it's organized and structured, I think it's probably likely that there's a couple of assembly members on the MPO, the governing body of the MPO, that's making the decisions on where these funds go. Certainly possible the mayor could be on it as well. None of those decisions have been made, but the structures that we've been looking at include folks that are empowered by voters to make decisions like this on their behalf. And then a level below that would be staff folks like me or some of my engineers that are experts on traffic management and those kinds of things that could advise the decision makers on where we think the monies will go. But it won't cost the borough money out of area wide. It'll give us an opportunity to provide staff input too. So there may be some costs in terms of staff time to feed information to the organization. But I think, I don't think you have to worry about the cost of it. It'll bring in money to the borough that we don't have right now. At least that's the way it's advertised.
So as far as sort of budgetary impact, if we're thinking about the future, not this year, but in future years, we might have additional funding of who knows how much, but additional funding for road projects out here, if we're kind of looking at our overall budget.
Additional, and the MPO, although we could, it's possible that we could work with them to execute their projects. They are, in concept, could execute their own projects entirely independent from the borough with their own funding.
All right, next up is Mr. Strawn for planning.
Thank you, Mr. Dolan, for.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, members of the Assembly, Alex Strawn, Planning Director, budget number 1. So there are challenges that.
You want us to go easy, is what you're saying.
Sure. So there are challenges that come with having preparing a budget of this size for the first time, but there's also an opportunity that there's fresh eyes put onto an old budget. And I will say that in this process, I have definitely gone through this with a fine tooth comb. And if there were money that was budgeted and not expended for over the past 3 years, and we couldn't brainstorm a reason why it was in there, we cut it. And our actual expenditures are quite a bit lower than our actual adopted budget. And a lot of that is the inability that we've had over the past few years to really keep a full load of people on board. We've had some turnover and some vacant positions, but that's, I think, the nature of the game and something we'll try to work towards in the future. You'll notice that, let's see. Okay, here we are. You'll notice that our amended budget this year is about $500,000 less than it was last year. And I'd love to take credit for that. But really a lot of that is personnel budget. I'll get into it. Really what this is a result of is we have one less position than we had last year, and that's because one of we had a planner 1 move over to finance department. They did mostly what they did was related to finance and grants and things like that. So that was $200,000 out of that $500,000. This slide does have a minor error. FY20 should actually, or FY21 should be 28 and FY22 should be 27. But the numbers are right, just the totals are a little bit wrong in that chart. But just in 2019, the Development Services Division got 2 new positions. That was a code enforcement officer, which, for the first time ever, or at least in the past 15 years, our total amount of open cases is shrinking, although slowly. In the past, our total amount of open cases has risen pretty rapidly. So we're on a right path when it comes to that. And then we did a couple of years ago in our planning division lose a planner 3 position. So out of our 4 divisions, it's really for the 3 out of the 4, the platting, administration, and development services, the operating budget is a very small percentage of the overall budget. It's really just mostly personnel. So we don't have a lot of flexibility without cutting positions and cutting that or anything. So I'm going to focus a lot of my attention here on the planning division, which does have an operating budget that I think requires some management and some forethought. So one of the big things that we want to tackle, and starting next year, is to update the borough-wide comprehensive plan. And so we are mandated by the state of Alaska to develop a comprehensive plan and to periodically update the comprehensive plan. And our borough-wide comprehensive plan was adopted in 2005. So we're over 15 years old at this point. And a lot of our community level comprehensive plans are even older than that and really adopted back in the 1990s. And this has real world consequences. Obviously, we've changed a lot in the past 15, 20 years. But when we go to process a conditional use permit, for instance, we're looking at what the comprehensive plan says. And if it doesn't reflect the current values of that community, that's a problem. So we want to not only update that document, the borough-wide comprehensive plan, but really update a lot of the community plans and figure out a way that we can more efficiently going forward, keep those plans up to date. That doesn't require a lot of extra staff and things like that. So it's going to be a major project. It's going to be a lot of public outreach, and it's going to be a multi-year project. And we're hoping to start that this next fiscal year. So Manager Brown asked me that, so I will say that the way I believe it has been done in the past is the director would budget between $150,000 and $250,000 in planning studies, not really knowing what that money is going to be used on. And then at the end of the year, they would do legislation to wrap it up into a project account that could sit there for a few years, maybe get extended. And so we have this money that's been allocated that's not being used. It's kind of tied up in these project accounts. It's not the best use of public funds. So one of the big cuts we've done this year is we're asking for zero in planning studies, because we have all of these project accounts out there that can keep us busy for this year. And so we're going to really be working through our project account money and starting some of these projects. This is by no means a comprehensive list of the different things the planning division is doing, but it is the major projects that are going to be requiring the help of engineering firms or consulting firms. So I kind of extended this out 5 years, and this year we're asking for zero in planning studies. But as we go forward and this graph gets refined and in further budget seasons, you'll see extended out, and we're still going to be asking for $150,000 to $200,000 a year probably, but you'll know what it's going to be spent on during that fiscal year, and that's the idea. So looking back at our accomplishments, we have quite a few accomplishments, and to me, like preparing some of these ordinances, getting the ordinance passed is not necessarily what we're striving for. We're looking to get something forward that's well thought out, has gone through a robust public process, and provided to this board to decide on whether to approve it or adopt it. But I just want to touch on a couple of these things. The subdivision construction manual was a major feat, and I can't take credit for it. It was really done by, Eileen Probasco really grabbed a group of people, the right group of people, and put them in a room and cooked for them and made them spend countless hours working on this thing. It hadn't been updated for 30 years, and it's a much better document than it was. So I think that is a major deal. Let's see here. The development of automated and efficient code enforcement permitting, and I really have to, this is accomplishment that's for us, but it's also really IT was a major part of making this accomplishment happen. And I'm really glad to see that other departments are going to start we kind of broke the ground on this mobile platform, and it's going to kind of go borough wide and increase efficiency throughout the borough. But it really was IT that played a big part in that as well. And if anybody has any questions about these things, I'm happy to answer them. So our major goals going forward, to touch on a couple of these, initiate flood code update. That's, I have a long list of different ordinances that need to occur, the changes of our existing code that will make things more clear and more efficient and just better. The flood code is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I think this is the year to do it. Our flood code is based on a model ordinance provided by FEMA that makes sure that it meets the minimum standards of the Code of Federal Regulations. But really working through it, it's not exactly clear what the developer needs to do and what we need to do as administrators of the code. There are certain federal requirements that are not explicitly listed in this code. So we end up in this weird position where you have to do this. And they say, well, where does it say that? Well, it's required by federal law. So what we want to do is take our code and update it to not make it more strict or less strict, but more clear for everybody involved so that they know what they're getting into and why they're doing what they're doing. And hopefully that's going to be good enough that that FEMA adopts that as their new model code. That's the goal. So PFD garnishments. This is something that got dropped during the cyber attack. And so we need to update some memorandums of understanding with the court system. We need to update some IT processes. There's a finance component involved. And this is when we go out to write a citation, say for junk and trash, if people don't pay it, there's really no recourse except for what we used to do is garnish permanent fund dividends, and nobody wants to have their permanent fund dividend garnished. And so this is kind of the stick part of our code enforcement that I think is a really important thing that we get back into place. And I'm pretty confident that we will do that during this fiscal year. So that's I think that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions that you have.
I just have one question. The marijuana ordinance, I thought we were all done with that. What are we gonna do now?
Well, that one got posted. So this is to address on-site consumption and potentially regulate limited cultivation facilities. I have been working with Assemblymember Hale. We have a meeting set up with some different members of the industry to kind of do some whiteboarding and spitballing and see what we come up with. So, but I'm fairly sure we're going to come back with something at least during this fiscal year.
Okay.
Mr. Yount?
Excuse me. I'd like to, hold on. Take a second. I know she's not here, but I want to thank you, but I also want to thank Eileen for the subdivision manual. That was, I know we had over 2,000 man hours into that, in that room downstairs between the group of us that worked on that for so long. And I know you guys had thousands of hours beyond that working on it. And the Matsu Borough is going to be a much better place because of it, with the roads, all the awesome engineers and surveyors that participated in that, and you guys and Jess and myself. It was a fun experience. It was drawn out for a couple of years because it got extended due to a cyber attack, but Mrs. Probasco did provide food for all 26 or so of those 4 to 8 hour meetings, and she was an absolute pleasure to work with. And that was a huge accomplishment. Our roads are going to be way better off in the future because of it. So thank you guys for working on that.
And I appreciate that. You know, after I was, I wasn't a huge part of the subdivision construction manual, but simultaneously I was working on the driveway ordinance, and I've learned a lot through the platting process and everything. And I can tell you that ignorance is bliss. Once you have all this knowledge of how all this works, you drive around and just see all the mistakes that occurred over time. And so I think it's expensive to repair, and there's expense to people's lives, for delays and accidents and things like that. So I think going forward, because of these efforts, we're going to be much better off as a borough.
For sure, public safety and taxpayer money in the future will be much better served with the new manual than it was with the previous ones.
Arctic Winter Games. Is your department getting tasked with a lot of the work on Arctic Winter Games? And how do you feeling? Stressed out and financial, or?
3 years. No.
No, I want to make sure. Are you guys okay?
Yeah. So, I mean, the submitting or preparing the bid package was a major effort for the planning division. And I explained to Kim Solian, it was like the snake who swallowed a deer and felt like they couldn't move because they had this big deer and we had to get it passed through, Now I think comes the fun part, and we have assistance from the purchasing division. And I think we're going to be just fine. We're going to be able to accomplish the other tasks along with that as well.
Feel good about your budgeting
Yes.
for the next couple of years to take on an event this size?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're going to have to assist with standing up a host society, and that we're going to fulfill certain portions of it, like participating in decision-making and boards and things like that. But ultimately they should be able to start fundraising, and we're not going to have to push out too much more money, hopefully. Hopefully the fundraising is successful and they can do all that. But it's going to be borough-wide. There's going to be multiple departments that are going to have to spend some time at least being involved in these committees and doing organizing and things. It's not just going to all fall on the planning department.
Questions down here, Ms. Nowers?
Thank you. I just kind of follow up on what the mayor said, that planning has so much on their plate. I mean, anytime I have an issue, whether, it's a plating issue or the shooting range ordinance, the marijuana, like nothing is simple. Nothing is like a quick issue. And as far as being proactive, what Mr. Yunt said, things that you can get ahead of save you in the long run. So I'm really impressed with the staff's ability to take on those large meals. But if there are things coming up and you see the need, I can't think of anything you kind of need more in a borough that's growing this rapidly than to try to stay ahead of the curve. So I hope you'll just keep us apprised of how you feel as we move forward and get into some of these issues.
And if I may make a comment real quickly, the mayor, to Ms. Nowers, to your point, I think that's one of the things that graph represents in this presentation is what we're trying to illustrate is what is something that's sustainable, because we don't staff for spikes in planning needs, right? We really have this steady across the board staffing. So what we want to do is develop a planning structure that requires where the updates are required for these various plans, that we plan that and program it in a way that it's sustainable and it fits within the staffing that we have, so that these things all don't come due at one time. And then inevitably what's been happening to some degree, that gets put off. We move the money into a project account. We try to pick it up at a later date. So what we're trying to find is kind of a sustainable approach, and we really get at the plans that are absolutely important and must be updated so that we hit our marks in terms of regular recurring updates. So we don't have these plans that we've spent money on in the past that become stale and relatively irrelevant. So I think that's what you're seeing here is the beginning of something that will allow us to kind of lay that out. And I think from a budgeting perspective, where it's beneficial is we recognize you're probably about $250,000 a year in planning studies and whatnot. It'll just be different studies each year or phases of different studies each year. And that's what will be represented so that the assembly understands when you appropriate that funding, we're going after these planning documents. And ultimately, the accountability in that is to complete the plans that we said we were going to do. So I think that's kind of the regime, or that's the regimen we're looking for, is to kind of build that. So you know what you're appropriating, you know what you're working on, we know what our priorities are, and we know what we're accomplishing. Now, the challenge for assembly members will be, as you have legislation that you want to go after and sponsor, we're going to have to factor that in and figure out what can we take on reasonably. So that's I think where the balance is, and we can't predict that every year. We don't know how long the marijuana ordinance rewrite's going to take. We don't know how long a wetland ordinance rewrite is going to take. We don't know how much a Jonesville public use area plan is going to take. So we've got to leave a little bit of flexibility in there. So when an assembly member comes up and says, I want you to look at this, we have some capacity to do that. But what I'm telling you is we're not going to budget for a lot of extra capacity to do that. And I think that's probably generally what you would have us do. What my obligation to you is helping to manage expectations around how much we can take on and accomplish in a given time. Okay?
No, thank you. And that's, those issues are what I was thinking about, because each of those, whether it's the wetlands mitigation or the shooting range or, even the septic issue, you can spend a lot of hours on those, and to do them well, you should know what all the rules are. And I just don't want to see us end up shortchanging those. So maybe it's on us as assembly members to think hard about what we bring forward and make staff do a lot of time on. But they're really important issues, and just again, being ahead of the curve is so much better than reacting to it.
With that being said, what is the proposed lake management plan update? Because when you guys start doing this again, I'm going to start hearing about it again. So.
Yeah. So this is sort of a carryover for one of Eileen's projects. She really tried to revise the code and the process for doing lake management plans. They're all unique. They all take a lot of staff time. The people, the communities who have lake management plans really appreciate them and really like them. I don't think it's something that should go away, but we're going to update the process so that you have basically a menu of options. If a community wants to put a lake management plan on their lake, they can do so, but they're going to have to, it's like going through the drive-through McDonald's. You have to pick a number 1, a number 2, or a number 3, or whatever. And it's not going to be a custom tailor thing that takes up a lot of staff time. That's the idea behind it. We're going to give a presentation to the next planning commission meeting, actually, on where we're at on that and what it's going to look like. That's basically the idea.
All right, Mr. Mayor, I think Ms. Heindel's up. She gets the Department Budget Presentations Red Lantern Award. We gave Mr. Wyatt a break. He had to go last year, so Cheyenne decided she'd round that up, and then I'll get up and close out with the capital budget.
Do we have the clerks and attorneys' budgets? So we get to hammer?
I believe they're online.
They have to give 45-minute presentations.
And by the way, just for the record, all of these presentations are online. We're online as of yesterday. So they're available for public viewing.
Yeah. Close. Escape. I wasn't paying attention.
So this is where the assembly should save up all their questions for the finance director. I think Mr. McKee's got one for her already about insurance.
Thank you.
Either use this or you can hit.
Right, enter. Well, good afternoon. I hope being last, that doesn't mean I'm slow. First off, I'm going to answer Mr. McKee's question regarding the 9 new Central Matsu firefighters. The benefits related to those 9 new firefighters is $455,000 roughly. The wages related to them are $547,000. So that's where we're projecting the cost of those new firefighters will be. Roughly, and realize that for firefighters, they pay a higher rate of PERS than regular employees. They have a higher schedule because they can retire earlier.
Before you go in, since you answered.
George, can you use your mic, please?
Before you go away, you answered one question, how about the second? Insurance.
I'm going to get to that in my budget if you'll let me
Okay.
go forward. Okay, so the finance department, as you know, we impact everybody in the borough. The finance department is actually made up of 5 divisions. One of those divisions is common contractual, which common contractual is the area where Mr. McKee is concerned about. It's the area where all the expenditures that relate to every area-wide entity in the borough is accounted for. Utilities, insurance, major equipment purchases, if we've got those budgeted for, some training that we know every employee in the borough has to have, or every area-wide employee. In this year's budget, you're going to see, actually, you will see that I gained an employee because I took a planning person from, well, I didn't take them, that was offered to me, a planning person from Alex's budget, and that person became a grant coordinator. And part of her responsibility is not only coordinating the grants that the borough gets and making sure that we're all on the same page and Public Works isn't trying to get this grant and community development is applying for the same grant and we're competing against each other, but also that finance is aware of what's being applied for, and we can control and assist the application of the grant process. One of the things that we've implemented as part of that change is we've actually subscribed to a grant search software where we can put in parameters and it will spit out potential matches for grants that we can apply for. We're hoping, I mean, we tested it for free for about a week. We saw the different persons that were testing it, saw 30, 40 grants come back. One of them was related to forestry, beetle kill, spruce, or infestations. We get one of those grants, we've paid for the price of the subscription for the year. So anyhow, that's a good change. That's the increase in my budget. Insurance. Overall, we are budgeting a 30% increase in insurance based upon our recommendation from our contractor. Last year, we budgeted the same increase. We got very lucky when we did the marketing trip and we only saw a 15% increase. And the marketing trip, when I say that was a virtual trip last year, it will be a virtual trip this year. We are hoping that 30% is the high end. We do know that other places have seen 50 to 100%. Property and casualty is an area that we could see a large increase in. And like I said, we're hoping 30% is a good number. We also have the potential for personal liability related to some of the various lawsuits that you've heard around against sexual molestation that are driving insurance costs up. So that is reflected in the common contractual budget. Let me just move on to that slide. So unfortunately, because I budget for a lot of unknowns, the increase in insurance, increases in utility costs, potential legal fees, in case we have litigation that exceeds what's in Nick's budget. And also in this year's budget, you will see that when you get the actual document, there is an increase in other contractual. We are budgeting for, and it will be up to your decision, for budgeting to give you guys the opportunity, if you so choose, to start the timelines running for the MPI process and in the agreement. So those are some of the things. And if you back out that MPI budget amount, the whole finance budget is less than what it was last year. Because that's the other thing we did. I have been slowly trying to rein this budget in. And we are seeing, as you can see, we are getting smaller and smaller on those variances, but we are reining it in. This year, we were busy. I mean, not only did we go from budget season, we went to CARES season, and CARES season took a lot of my staff's time. I have 2 people in revenue budget that worked almost exclusively on the business grants. I mean, along with a couple people from IT, that almost became a full-time job for them. Our grants coordinator took over and helped administer the grants that we gave to direct recipients in the communities, such as the State Fair and the Muskox Farm. So CARES, we went into CARES season, and CARES season ran from April until, well, it's still running, and we're going to go into RPIR soon as we have some regulations. They did a phenomenal job. They got a lot of money out in the community. We got a lot of things done, and we produced tax bills and collected taxes, and we did an audit, which we did very well at. And we're back to budget season. I mean, it used to be there was a break. There hasn't been a break. So CARES was a big accomplishment. The fact that we were able to get our audit done on time, the CAFR out, the budget award, we got the Citizens Financial Report out and got the award for that. That was, for the first time, that was a big deal. This year, and in fact, we are in the processes of implementing a reporting disclosure software. It will basically assist us in building our budget books, our CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. Currently, we pay the auditors to do that. We will be able to eliminate a portion of that cost by doing it ourselves. This software will actually provide the document for us, so we're not paying them. They will just have to review it. So we're counting that as not only accomplishment because the CAFR portion and some of the new GASB, which none of you really care about, the new GASB reporting standards, they will provide support for implementing those standards that we have to meet. We will also be implementing the rest of that in the next fiscal year, and that's one of our major goals. The other thing is we are, working closely with Public Works to make sure we get the full amount of FEMA reimbursement that we should get based upon the earthquake, any fires, and of course, any floods that are still remaining. We're hoping, again, like I said, when we do our virtual marketing trip, that for insurance that we will not see a 30% increase, but not more than a 30% increase. And then as we go forward, we have been working with IT. The whole department has assessments and collections, budget and revenue, to make sure the govern upgrade is implemented and it works so that we don't see any problems moving forward with assessment notices and tax billing in the future. And if there's any questions.
Why don't you tell our new assembly members about our reserves? We've got 3-4 reserves, what reserves are and how much is in each.
We have several reserves. We have the fund balance stabilization reserve, which sits at 25 million. We have a reserve for emergency services, or not emergency services, emergencies, which by code cannot exceed 1.2 million. We also have a reserve for major maintenance and another reserve for capital. Currently, those reserves are sitting at 300,000 and 500,000 respectively. We're hoping to increase both of those back up to $1 million. They used to be that way in the past. Then we are required to have a reserve for compensated absences, which basically means if every employee was forced to take off for the first 3 months of the year, we can cover the liability of that leave. And the final reserve of 500,000 is for our self-insurance reserve, which basically covers us for that first 500,000. Those are our reserves. We also have then our unassigned fund balance, which is the fund balance that is not reserved this year. Let me get my CAFR. As of June 30 of last year, that was $15.3 million.
Can you give the assembly what you're projecting that to be with this proposed budget? Because there is an application of fund balance.
June 30th, 2021.
As we have done traditionally, every year we start with total fund balance when we build our budget. This year, as you saw in the manager's presentation, we are looking at using roughly $17 million, just over $17 million to balance the overall budget. So when we are done, we're looking at a unassigned reserve of about between 1.5 and $2 million. We're still finalizing those numbers.
Mr. Yount?
Thank you. I noticed in our budget earlier, investment income, you were figuring it to be about $6 million. So what is our ROI on that? So for example, if we got 6%, that means we had 100 million invested. If we got a 3%, we had 200 million invested. But what are we getting for a return on that?
Well, I mean, it's changing every month. As you know, when we started this fiscal year, we were actually receiving about 2.25%. We had a really robust investment pool. Right now, as of our last review of it, which was less than a month ago, we are looking at 0.88%. Some of our investments going out, as you know, interest rates are down to 0.25, depending on the length. We are seeing some of those 0.25s have now become 0.67s when you get out 3 and 4 years. So there is some growth coming back into the market, not a lot. But that's where we're at right now.
Mr. Sumner?
What's the name of our insurance broker? It's Marsh and,
Marsh McClellan?
okay, they don't give us any financial advice, right? Or
No, they're totally insurance brokers.
okay,
So we look to them for instance, the estimate on how much our potential
right.
renewal costs are going to be.
I was just curious because I did read a Reuters article that they had advised Credit Suisse that Green Silk Capital was adequately insured, which turned out to not be the case. At least alleged that they had advised that by email. So,
Are there any other questions, Mr. McKee?
Mr. McKee?
You were talking about fund balance, and I'm going to go back to insurance because it is, we share, as I understand it, 30/70 with the school district for our liability insurance. Is that correct? Roughly?
Roughly, what we do when we go out, we share premiums. So we go out because of size, economy of scale, we market together. So yes, they share they get their premium on theirs, we get our premium on ours. It's a roughly 70-30 split.
Okay, so when the Marsh McLennan people came up, they pointed out that across the United States, and they didn't know how it was going to affect us, that in fact liability, not general liability, but actually the liability that covered such things as child abuse and what have you, okay, we're being canceled. That essentially is, you almost can't insure that. If we were placed in the position of not getting that insurance this year, that would profoundly affect our reserves, wouldn't it? Wouldn't we have to set aside cash reserves for that?
It could, and if we're in that position, believe me, I will be coming back to the assembly with a recommendation. Right now, what we're doing is the carrier that provides that coverage for us has requested that we place we develop a policy on how we respond to such a situation, and we implement training in those areas that are high risk. And we are doing that, and they have currently told us that if we have those things in place, they will renew with us.
Okay, real good. Thank you.
On emergency disaster reserve, did you say it was under?
It is it's $1,250,000 and that's the cap that is set in code.
Okay, that
That's
money's
where
in
it
there
sits.
now. So if we had another disaster, we could start with that. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Any other questions for Chief Financial Officer? Looks like you're going, and Mr. Brown's coming down. Thank you very much.
All right, we're on the home stretch. That's the good news. Fortunately, you've heard about most of these projects. There are a couple I want to spend a little bit of time on. I'm not going to highlight all of these. I'm just going to talk about 4 specifically. I'm going to talk about the historic Iditarod Trail crossing Burma Road. So this was an issue that was brought to our attention. I've had multiple conversations with Mr. 2 in District 5 and the mayor about this. There's been some safety issues along Burma Road where mushers and snow machiners have had issues with the crossing. One of the other challenges in that area as well is we're seeing the change of land ownership. So where folks have historically used trails in the winter for various purposes, and it was really unchecked, you're now having landowners move in and they are not interested in having folks trespass. Now, some of these trails have been in existence for years. Specifically, there's one that went through a court case and it is now, I guess, what we're calling the historic Iditarod Trail, that meanders and then users are ending up on a different trail that's not ideal. That crossing is not ideal. There have been a couple of injuries and issues with vehicle traffic and a snow machiner and with mushers trying to negotiate that crossing. So we are looking at this as a potential way to kind of realign the trail, make it clear and sign it, clear and grub it, and create an underpass where you don't have mushers and snow machiners and arguably probably ATV folks in the summertime potentially that are interacting with vehicle traffic on that terrain. So we had an engineer run a cost estimate and look at what it might take to put in an underpass there, and we estimate that to be about $760,000. And we recognize it's a large chunk, but with the terrain, we have to acquire right-of-way, get slope easements, do a fair amount of excavation. The pipe itself is pretty expensive, but we think that would be potentially a project that the Assembly might be interested in. So what we wanted to do in these projects that are on this list before you, these are basically the projects that are listed in the capital budget that you will see in your budget book that are in excess or $100,000 or more. So I wanted to put them on one list. So if you had specific questions or wanted to talk about them today, we could go do that. So what we did is we included these in the total budget so that you could see how the math turns out. So what I described to you earlier in the overview with regard to the area-wide mill rate and all of that, and all of the mill levies includes all of these in the capital budget. So this is representative of the $8.6 million that I spoke to you earlier about. So obviously, as the Assembly, you have the ability to run an amendment, remove some of these, add to it, modify it as you see fit. But this one I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking to. I don't know if Mr. Tu or the mayor has anything they would like to add on this before I move on to another project.
Well, I'll just say that, of course, I'm very familiar with this trail, but the Burma Road, the problem with the Burma Road is the amount of traffic in the last few years is going up, and it's going up drastically. So when people are crossing, they're going straight across this road. The berms are up high, people can't see. I imagine a snowmobiler has a little bit more of an ability to come to a full stop, but some don't. There was a young lady, a junior musher that got basically run down the road for, I don't know, half mile and a half, something of that nature, then got hurt. I think what's going to happen here is probably somebody's going to get seriously injured, if not killed in this spot. The historic trail is actually the old Susitna crossing trail too. There is a corridor there. There was a big lawsuit a few years ago with another one of these private property owners, and the court just basically granted the easement for the trail. This new property owner that Mr. Brown's talking about, it's kind of hemming and hawing. I guess you'd have to file another case, which nobody wants to do, but there is a historic corridor that is an easement right through here that they'd match up for the Burma Road. And I think you'll get a lot of people from the Kinnick area, from the Kinnick Community Council, dog mushers. They all realize that this is something's going to happen drastically. So, and the number myself, it caught me by totally surprise. I had in my head, several 100,000 at the most, but and Mr. Tu is aware that we put a tube in on Hawk Lane, when they redid Hawk Lane. So that'd be the same type of thing, so that there's no doubt you're going to make that trail crossing without a vehicle problem. That's what this is all about. So
and as we looked at this, there was an at-grade crossing option that's much cheaper, but it's not going to end up being as safe in the long term. So that's what we're looking at here. So we wanted to provide you with the better option for your consideration. So what we will do is reach out to the Kinnick Community Council and the there's a trail, or would you call them the Trailblazers, Mr. Mayor? But we'll reach out to them and make them aware of the budget hearing at the Menard on, I think it's April 29th, so that they can come and testify if they see fit. So I just kind of wanted to give you some background on that. So if you hear more about it, you kind of heard how we arrived at this and what the genesis of this project was. It really stemmed from this issue that arose out along that road. Mr. Tu had a comment, Mr. Mayor.
When I was working with the folks out there, I just want to make sure that they're totally involved in the site actual selection and whatnot. So they feel like that their voices were heard and that they were a part of what we're trying to accomplish out there.
Okay, so I'm sorry, another comment, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, Mr. McKee.
I just have a question here. I really like this list, okay? Do you have a copy that you can furnish, just this list that we have on the screen? I think it's wonderful. Okay, that allows me to go through and write you, 20 memos requesting info on, right?
It'll be in his budget under capital. It's always been in there for many years, so.
Well, yeah, but I'm interested just in this, okay? I don't want to look through 3 pages, or 30 pages. I want 1 page.
It's usually a page and a half.
Okay, I'm a simple guy. I want simple information.
They're always there.
But just for the record, if I may, Mr. Mayor, in the capital budget, or in the budget book in the capital budget, there will be a justification, write-up, narrative for each of these projects. I'm just giving you the bullet point, high-level overview for today.
Is it tab O?
Did you get it?
It's tab O.
Oh, it's in there. Yes, correct. I was thinking, but for record, when the ordinance is introduced, there'll be there'll be descriptions around this for you to reference in the documents moving forward.
3-wing binder, tab O, Mr. McKee.
So if I may, I'm going to move on to another one. I'm going to highlight. I would talk about Station 39 with EMS. I'm sorry, do we have a question?
Sorry. And I have an extra copy too, Mr. McKee. I'll send mine down to you. Maybe this is a dumb question, but I know in Anchorage, on the trail systems there, they have bridges and I go over and I ski over them in the winter. Why would you not go over instead of under?
I tell you, I love this comment because I asked them about a bridge over. They feel like it'd be more costly. I don't know myself.
We think so. I just wanted to look back and see Mr. Dolan nodding north and south, because if he's like, no, I wouldn't want to say that. But we think that would be more costly and more difficult to maintain, because we're also looking, most of these underpasses for the most part, once we put them in, there's not a whole lot of maintenance for us to do there. And we're not really looking forward to taking on any more recurring maintenance costs associated with this. I could see some challenges with a bridge as opposed to a piece of pipe. But we're certainly worth looking at whatever the assembly might desire. We think that's the better option, and it's more consistent with what we've been doing. I mean, there's a number of underpasses along the Port Mac rail extension. There, Hawk Lane we talked about. There are other places where we've done this exact thing in other areas, and I think it would work well in this setting.
When you leave Anchorage on the Didrad, you go through 2 major underpasses, and then you go over out by the Native Hospital, cruising up over the road there. So it's really fun. Dogs love it.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add? Oh, step back.
Terry Dolan, Director of Public Works. So the only thing I would add is that not only is the tube less expensive, but anytime you have a situation where the pathway or the span is narrow, you always want to use a pipe rather than a bridge, because it's so much lower cost. In a situation like you're talking about in Anchorage, where you might have, it may be wide enough for 2-way traffic. And I know they drive trucks over it for maintenance purposes. And the span is much longer, then it makes sense to use a bridge. But for a real narrow thing where you might just have a couple of snow machines passing underneath there, you don't need a bridge or that kind of cost.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking of up on the hillside. There's one up by Service High School, kind of a narrow it's really a pedestrian bridge.
Yeah, and there are pedestrian bridges with much larger spans, typically like over a roadway that's 20, 30 feet across each segment of it. Like So in a case like that where you have to span a much greater distance, you would want to use a bridge, and it would be much more expensive.
Okay, are we good on that one? I'm going to move on to another highlight. I want to go to EMS 39. Ken Barkley did a really nice job of laying that out, but I think like my logic in making this recommendation to you or including 39, I mean, I've got it represented here as 3.5 million in all fairness. That's the area wide. 2.5 in fire, which Ken discussed. So it's a total of a $6 million ask. When we talked about this, the conditions for me to include this in the budget were, one, we vacate the 2 buildings where we have staff now. And I don't mean vacate and use it for another purpose. The Breeden was a lease, so we're clearly out of that. But it's utilities and liability we don't have to own anymore. The second one was we sell 39 in the industrial park. A business can use that for a better purpose. And there's no reason that we would continue to have to maintain and pay utility costs in that building. So what we're really doing, and I think one of the things that's interesting with this approach, this would be the first large station that because we've done warm storage buildings out of, our funds, but we've never built a large station outside of taking on debt. So this would be the first time where we would actually pay it forward and not have a COP, because those are off the table now, those certificates of participation. So we don't incur any debt here. So this is a slightly different approach from what we've done in the past. The other thing in my mind that helps to make sense out of this is we received a large benefit from CARES Act funding that really did support medical services, emergency medical services for the borough. Essentially what we're doing is taking some of that payback, if you will, because we're able to apply that to wages for paramedics and reinvesting it in EMS infrastructure that's going to serve the borough for many years to come. The response time specifically for the Butte and going out to Sutton and out Fishhook, when you look at Palmer, Fishhook, and up to Hatcher Pass, that's going to continue to be an issue for us. And this improves those response times pretty significantly. So when I look at this, it's a good reinvestment, if you will, of funds to build into or to pour into infrastructure that's going to serve us for years. And as I mentioned, we're talking about some consolidation. So we're out of the Breeden, we're out of the existing 3-9, but we got to build the new station before we can vacate and sell the old building. So when we looked at it and analyzed it from a financial perspective, this seemed like the best approach for building that out over time and ultimately consolidating some of those services. As far as the ambulance refurb, the mayor had mentioned that as well. And just so the assembly kind of understands that recurring nature, the CARES Act funding did take care of 3 ambulances, but that was because there was a reduction in the refurb the previous year. We only did 1 ambulance. So the 3 got us back on par. Generally speaking, with the ambulance fleet that we have and the ambulances that we have in services, you can expect us to request 2 ambulance refurbs a year. So again, from a budgeting perspective, we're trying to find something that doesn't have these large spikes and valleys because it's difficult for us to plan revenues around that. So essentially what we found is a sustainable construct based on usage and based on the size of our fleet that we would refurb 2 ambulances every year. So that's what you're seeing when you see that number. Is you're going to see that again and again because we're projecting that as a sustainable approach. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about West Susitna Access public involvement. I had mentioned when Ada was out here before, they talked about West Sioux, talked about phase 2 and what phase 3 might look like. And we had a meeting internally and kind of talked about, I had a conversation with the Ada executive director after our last assembly meeting. And then we met internally as a staff and kind of talked about where do we want to go with this. The borough's primary obligation in this memorandum of agreement, if I were to just summarize it, is to really manage the public involvement. So what I'm suggesting and what we kind of agreed to as a staff that we would put into the budget is to budget for $100,000, but basically that money will stay in-house. We're not gonna give that to Ada. We're not writing them a check. We will use that to buy some contract support to specifically support public involvement for the moving forward as this road. So the partnership will stay intact, but we're not going to hand the money to Ada to execute. We will keep it as a borough and execute the public involvement on our own behalf. I think there's been some concerns around handing Ada money and having them do that and that not being done well and whether they think we should be doing that. Basically what we're acknowledging is we'll own it and we'll manage it and we'll do that in partnership with Ada as we move forward. So that's what the $100,000 essentially allows us to do, is to start moving forward to get, we have a contractor in mind who's known well for doing, or has done a really good job with her firm in public involvement in large road projects for DOT across the state. So we think her firm would be a good fit for something like this and really allow us to make sure we're doing our part to engage the residents of the borough regarding this project. So those are the 4 highlights I have off the capital list. If you have specific questions on anything in here, I'm happy to take those at this time.
Well, I imagine I'm the Ada's favorite mayor.
Mr. Mayor, if I may say, I don't think you'll get a Christmas card from him this year.
I'll just say it again. On a project like that, you're $100,000 for it's fine. I mean, if that's the direction the manager and the assembly wants to go. But, the railroad project, it's the same thing. It's kind of lies idle. And it was kind of a state pushing that. And then, of course, now whose is it? It's the boroughs. We own it. And I'm just a little bit worried about that Susitna access, that's going to cost a lot more than $350 million when it's all done. That whether you can even get it done, and whether it's timing, and whether or not the private partnerships will actually be there. And so, but that's all I got to say. And that was it, Mr. Tews and Ms. Bovee, and who was next?
I would just like to ask, where is the Big Lake Boat Launch parking?
Phillips is probably gone, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. So through the mayor to Mr. Tew, I'll follow up with you on that. We'll get and actually we'll follow up with all of you on that. So we can probably put that in a weekly post or something. And that's kind of the benefit of doing these presentations today, is we kind of get all that out there so we can make sure if there's any gaps that we have, we can close that. But we'll follow up, Mr. Tew.
Ms. Bovee, did you have something?
Yeah, just a question about the bridge and railroad match funding. Is that separate from the license plate tab fees? That is thank you.
Through the mayor to Assemblymember Bovee, that is the license registration fees. That's the portion that we feel will be available for capital.
So that'll be match money for various projects coming in. Bridge and
That is up to Public Works discretion on what projects they apply it for,
Right.
because that railroad crossing upgrades and whatnot.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I have the last slide for the day. And this is it, just to kind of wind up and wrap up the timeline, just so we understand where we are and what's next. I talked about this. We'll be going into the budget hearings here next. So we'll be preparing for that. Ms. Heindel and her staff will be working on the budget books, the introduction of the ordinance, and getting all that legislation and everything drafted. I'm hoping the presentations today gave you a good sense for the overall budget. I'm hoping that it gave you as assembly members some talking points around the budget, because I'm sure your constituents will be reaching out to you and asking questions about the mill rate and different capital projects and things that are of interest to them. And hopefully you'll see not just, hey, here's the money that we're asking for, but what we intend to do with it. So I know we spent a number of hours here, and this can be a somewhat dry topic that can drone on and on, but hopefully we've kept it to a point where you'll walk away and feel like this was useful to you. And I would like to thank Cheyenne and the finance staff. They've been, as you can see when you look at this timeline, we're on the 4th month of this. Well, this is your first take at it, but staff have been working pretty diligently in the background to get this all prepared for you. So I appreciate Ms. Heindel and her staff and the directors for their work. This being my #1 budget, probably created a little bit more work for some of them as I'm kind of walking through this and trying to understand why we do what we do. So with that said, I don't have anything else for you today, Mr. Mayor, Assembly, unless you have any follow-on questions or anything for staff this afternoon now.
Is there any more questions for the manager? There's going to be comments from everybody in a second. Madam Clerk, did you want to talk about amendments now, or do you want to save that for?
I will probably bring a a memo forward at the next regular meeting, Mr. Mayor, with the budget amendment sheets and explaining the process.
How amendments come in to change the budget from individual assembly members. Usually, I guess we could say it's usually Madam Clerk likes them in writing, so she could get them published to other assembly members prior to the deliberation meetings, and so we can handle that later. So I guess we're at comment time. So Mr. Sprout, Mr. McKee?
Yes.
Assemblymember McKee, can I get you to turn your mic on, please?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm probably ahead of the attorney, but look, our last meeting, we had a lady named Amy Henry come in and presented a lot of work showing that in fact she was being penalized by the borough, not her fault, and not the borough's fault, but the post office in handling her tax. So, and we leveled a penalty on her for this late payment. Therefore, I offer before the assembly, I would like a resolution to forgive the penalty that we have levied against her for late payment on her property tax.
A motion. Okay.
Yep, motion.
Motion to forgive the, it was a $200 penalty.
Yes, $200 penalty.
Mr. Spropoulos, did you want to comment, or is it?
Do you want me to comment?
No.
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 So I believe, I believe the manager addressed
Sumner?
this. Oh.
I'm not sure it's appropriate to forgive a single person's penalties as opposed to waive all penalties, but I think that might be a bad idea too. Yeah, I don't know. Perhaps maybe the attorney would comment on this, but if you give one person different treatment, then you might be either obligated to do the same for everybody or sort of create an unfair situation, I would think.
Go ahead, please.
See, look, under normal circumstances, if a person just came in and gave you a little song and dance that and why they're late in filing their property tax, I would agree with Assemblyman. But on this, the lady went through and gave she did a lot of research. And in fact, having dealt with the post office myself and had similar circumstances, I really understand it. What we would be doing if we don't waive that is we're really saying the post office, we're going to ding her for the post office's mistake. Not hers, not the borough's, but for the U.S. Post Office. And I think that's unfair.
Mr. Yount, and then Mr. Sumner again.
I definitely agree with Mr. McKee that it is unfair. With that being said, and I wholeheartedly believe Mrs. Henry, with that being said, we may be creating a precedent here where everybody just decides to say, well, it was not picked up. So if we're going to do this, I feel like we need to set forth some sort of standard and put something in paper, because I'm all for it. I am, George. I'm all for it. But I just want to make sure we don't open up a can of worms that so that's all I got to say.
Mr. Sumner, then Ms. Bovee.
I would just like to point out, and I don't have that sheet that she had there with her tax forms, but my recollection was that she presented it as being a $200 penalty, but in actual fact, something like $170 of it was principal, and the actual penalty, I think, was less than $10. I mean, I could be wrong, but.
Chief Financial Officer, you have a.
Through the mayor to the assembly. Her delinquent notice showed principal of around $78 and $88 each, and then penalty. However, the way we apply payments, when her payment came in, eventually it didn't come in on the 17th as was postmarked. It came in later, was processed later. The penalty, the 5% penalty had already been accrued. So she paid penalties first and it reduced the amount of taxes that were paid. So you could look at that as that late notice as, yes, she paid almost $200 in late fees.
Penalty then, or late fees?
Yes.
Okay. Now, who is next? Ms. Bovee?
Yeah, Director Heindel, how many delinquent accounts do we usually have after taxes are due?
We
How many
mail
letters?
out, let me start this way, through the mayor to Assemblymember Bovee. We mail out roughly 74,000 tax bills. At the end of August, at the end of February, when we get ready to do delinquents, we mail out anywhere between 9,000 and 11,000 delinquent notices. We mailed out 9,000 delinquent notices. We didn't mail out any more than we have in the past. In fact, since I've been here, we've nailed out between 9,000 and 11,000 delinquent notices, even when we had about 50,000 parcels. That's consistently what we mail out.
Ms. Bovee?
Yeah, so it's probably fair to assume that of those 9,000, there's probably quite a few compelling stories as to why someone would be late, either accidentally or through no fault of their own, including probably more people who have envelopes postmarked the 17th, correct?
Through the mayor to Assemblymember Bovee, yes, we've have calls every tax year that they mailed on time. We recommend, just like when people mail in their PFD application, that if you want to ensure that is postmarked on time, you need to go into the post office and have it canceled. Mail that is posted here in the borough goes into Anchorage before it is postmarked and mailed out here unless you go to the counter. That's just the way it is. We also, have a lot of people that have a lot of other reasons why it was late. And I can tell you, we didn't get any more calls than we normally do this time of year with delinquent notices either.
Ms. Bovee?
Thank you. I really don't doubt that this happened to Ms. Henry. I've got some post office stories of my own. I just have real concerns if we go down this road that we're going to have dozens, if not hundreds of people coming in to share their story. And I really don't want to go there. Thank you.
Ms. Nowers?
Thank you, through the mayor. I have personally experienced being late as a new time property owner many years ago. And my memory then is the interest compounded daily back then, but that's no longer, I had to come directly into the borough because it was like I couldn't write a check and send it because the amount would change. But so I'm glad to hear that it's no longer compounded daily. Go ahead, and then I have one comment.
Through the mayor to Assemblymember Nowers, the interest does not compound daily. It never has. It goes on once a month. The penalty is applied 5%, and 5%, 30 day after due date, and then 30 days thereafter until we get to a total of 15%. That's probably what you were concerned about, was the penalty.
Mine was every day. I don't know, but that was many years ago. Anyways, 9,000 people is a big can of worms to open up, and can't support this, even though I understand.
So did I hear you, penalty can never go over 15%?
Right,
Okay.
Borough Code establishes a penalty of 15%.
Okay.
So if they pay before the second or third penalty goes on, they do not get charged additional penalty.
Anything else? I suppose we better vote on this unless there's any further discussion. There is a motion on the floor to basically waive or delete Amy Henry's overdue tax bill or penalty. So Madam Clerk, why don't you?
I'm going to have to do a voice vote, Mr. Mayor. Assemblymember Nowers.
No.
Assemblymember McKee.
Yes.
Assemblymember Yunt.
No.
Assemblymember 2.
No.
Assemblymember Sumner.
No.
Assemblymember Bovee.
No.
Mr. Mayor, it failed with Assemblymember McKee in support.
Well, I'm kind of a softie. Miss Henry had me hook, line, and sinker. I'd have probably voted for that, but anyway, I don't know if there's something we could write in the ordinances or something like that to make a change if you wanted to look at that. I don't know what would be fair to the public, but.
So,
maybe
Mr.
that's
Mayor, members of the Assembly, part of your debate here is only highlighted that there will always be people on the margin. In the past couple of days, I've looked at cases from the U.S. Supreme Court, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, Alaska Supreme Court, tax appellate courts, and the Office of Administrative Hearings regarding permanent fund dividends. There are always people on the margins. There are always people that, no matter how flexible you make the rule, there will be. But the takeaway that I've come, and I've talked to the finance director briefly about this, is that our rule could actually be tightened up to establish a little bit better what circumstances would apply to make it very easy. Because unless you want to set up an Office of Administrative Hearings to hear these potentially several thousand cases every year, which would be incredibly expensive to set up and maintain, then the rule should just be really black and white, and then the Assembly can have some discretion in setting perhaps a delayed date, or when the date is due and what counts and what doesn't count, just so it's really black and white. But there will always be people on the margins, always.
I believe that. More comments? Mr. Tooze, comments? Ms. Bovee? Before I forget you, Mr. Sumner? Budget comments, Ms. Nowers?
I just really wanted to thank the manager and staff. I thought that was a great presentation this year. I really appreciated the consistency between them and being able to look back over the years. So really appreciated that. And I just wanted to be the first to wish everybody happy spring.
Mr. Young, is it spring today? I mean, have you been looking out the window, Ms. Nowers? Mr. Young? I'll just say I want to thank all our borough staff directors for the great reports today. I really liked the presentation, Mr. Manager. I really enjoyed the fact that we weren't hearing different things from each department as compared to what the manager's budget was going to be eventually. I do want to thank Ms. Heindel for all the work she always does in budgets, and we appreciate that. But I really want to correct the record. Now, the area-wide mill rate as presented by the manager was 10. But I had recommended prior to this being published that it be 9.9999. So a huge difference. I just want everybody to know that. And but I was glad to see it come down a little bit. And we're kind of in that range where this is my 12th budget. I think Mr. McKee's 6th budget in a row. So this will be our last budgets. But I think this was by far the best presentation. And when I look at this budget and how it's presented, you could almost, of course, you got to do your public hearings and listen to what the public's saying, and each individual assembly member has to make some decisions on certain things. But I would say that this budget could be approved almost as is. And the borough would be in very good shape. I know, Mr. McKee, you had your chance. You don't turn that mic off, please. I didn't say this was absolute. I said this could happen, Mr. McKee. So. Now, we'll change the dates of the hearings and deliberations, and we won't notify Mr. McKee. No, I'm just kidding. This was a very delightful budget presentation, and so I'm sure there will be changes. And Madam Clerk will advise you of the amendments and how to do that in the process, but please get them into her in writing in a timely fashion so she could get them out to the other assembly members. So with that, we will adjourn. Looks like, what do you think, Madam Clerk, 2:42?
Yep.
2:42 p.m. adjournment.